Okay, so here's chapter 9, talking about work teams and groups. Now, something that I mentioned at the end of our last class together is that when we talk about teams and we're interested in making them as effective as possible, the number one thing that you need to remember, is that it's all about relationships. That in fact, the best functioning teams function as well as they do because people have spent time, allocated effort toward, and have focused on relationship building. So I want to encourage you to keep that in mind, especially as you continue to participate in short-term project teams for your classes. Build those relationships and the tasks will happen and they'll happen well. So, what are the characteristics of a well-functioning, effective team? First, you need to have a relaxed, comfortable, and informal atmosphere. People have to feel as though they belong. Second, everyone has to understand the task and just as importantly, in addition to understanding the task, they have to accept the task. Third, members of the team need to listen well and participate, be very active in sharing their ideas. Those ideas and feelings need to be expressed as they are percolating, not set aside, not waited on. The conflict and disagreement that are inevitable. I mean, you're interacting with people, no matter how much you might like them, there will be things that you disagree upon, and some of those disagreements really need to be addressed, especially the ones that center around ideas and methods. Basically, what is it that we're doing and how are we doing it? The team needs to be aware of its operation and function. Decision making needs to happen by consensus. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody agrees 100% with every single thing, but rather that they agree to go forward with the decision as it's been made. They agree to support the decision as it's been made. Even if they may have some lingering doubts, they set those doubts aside and they get on board with the decision. And finally, clear assignments are made so each person knows what he or she is supposed to be doing as a member of the team, and everyone accepts their assignments. When we talk about team formation and development, there are three issues that teams need to address. The first category deals with interpersonal issues. So these are matters of trust, personal comfort, security. Do people feel safe expressing their ideas and their feelings? Do they trust one another? Do they believe that the other people in the group are competent and that they have integrity, that they will follow through on their promises? The second category, task issues. So does everyone know what the mission or purpose of the team is, how we're going to go about, the methods that we're going to use to get the job done, and then what are the outcomes? By when do we expect to accomplish what? The last major category deals with authority issues. Here we're talking about how the team is led. Are we going to be doing shared leadership where everyone takes on a role with leading and influencing each other? How are we going to manage that power and influence? And then how are we going to communicate? How are we going to make sure that we're really listening to one another? How are we going to make sure that people know what they need to know when they need to know it? What you see on this page and in your lecture outline is the first of two models of team development. So this is Tuckman's model. It's from 1965. Tuckman was a sociologist. And he talks about this five-stage model, starting with forming. In the forming stage, this is just imagine, think of any student project team that you've ever been a part of. So at the beginning of the semester, you come together. You don't really know what it is you're supposed to be doing, but you're, optimistic that things will work out. But there isn't a whole lot of agreement yet on what you're going to be doing because you really just don't know what you're going to be doing. Your purpose is pretty unclear, and so what you need more than anything from a leader is guidance and direction. Here's what we're going to be doing, here's how you need to focus your efforts, and so on. The second stage, storming, is the one where most student project teams get stuck. They never actually get out of this stage. They might turn something in at the end of the semester or give that end of the semester presentation, but it's not their best effort. Really, what this model ought to be called is a model of high-functioning team development. when a team actually manages the storming phase or the stage really well, they come out of this stage better able to communicate, better able to create with one another because they've figured out an effective approach to managing the conflict that's part of every single team ever. But most student project teams just don't ever really figure out the conflict management piece because individuals will decide, for example, it's not worth bothering with, it's only for a semester, I'll just never work with this person again. I just want to get a grade, etc., etc., not recognizing that the habits they're creating in college will carry over into the workplace and that the workplace is not dramatically different when it comes to teams. So if a team does this stage well, the conflict will increase the team's clarity of purpose. You'll have power struggles, and in the end, people will have figured out how are we going to share leadership? How are we going to share power? What a leader needs to provide for a team in this stage is coaching on how to manage their conflict. The third stage, and again, this assumes that the team effectively manages the storming stage. The third stage is norming, and this is where people come to agreement on a number of things. They engage in more consensus decision making, that people have very clear roles and responsibilities. And now all we need is facilitation, just enabling people to do what they've already bought into. The fourth stage, performing, I'm not talking about finishing an assignment. That's not performing. Performing is that really awesome, that amazing, we won the championship, we came out of this thing, we delivered the best possible output that we could have delivered. Here people have a clear vision and purpose. Everyone is focused on achieving the goals. And what leaders need to do in this stage is delegate. In other words, let people do their jobs. Let people do what they know how to do without getting in their way. The last stage is adjourning. Here we've completed the task. Everybody's feeling good about the team's achievements. And so the proper thing to do is to recognize, hey, look at the amazing work that we did together. Look at what we accomplished and so on. Now remember what I said. Most student project teams, they'll turn something in, they'll be done, and everybody's happy to go their own way. If they get through the storming phase well, if they manage that well, they get to this last thing and they're truly celebrating together. All right, the second model of team development, and we're focused really on temporary or short-term teams, just like the ones that you're a part of in your classes. So this model, which is put forth by Gerzik in the 1980s, suggests that teams go through transitions between inertia, where they're not really doing much of anything, and activity. So that equilibrium, that sort of, is punctuated every so often by bursts of activity. So it starts out pretty high level in terms of energy, the team setting its direction. We're gonna be amazing, we're gonna do a great job, we're gonna get this done early. And then the first phase of inertia sets in. So imagine over the course of a semester, the project team starts out and everybody's, psyched and they're ready to go forward. And then there's like this sort of not a whole lot going on phase. And then you get to the halfway point. So whatever the deadline is, halfway to that point. In a spring semester, it's easy to identify this because this is spring break, right? You get to that halfway point, people come out of that halfway point, and now they're like, oh man, we have a lot of work to do in a very short period of time. So they'll maybe change their process, they'll maybe change their focus a little bit. There's all kinds of activity, and then you get a second phase of inertia where not a whole lot goes on. Now, why the inertia? Why does that happen? Well, very simply because you and I have so many things that demand our time. And so if we're not feeling the pressure of a deadline, an imminent deadline, we have a tendency to focus on other things. We need something to focus our attention on a given activity in order for us to actually focus on that activity. So that second phase of inertia happens because, the pressure isn't quite what it could be yet. It's not enough to really get people moving. Then you get to the last part, which is where we see accelerated activity. So this is the last couple of weeks of the semester, and you all know what I'm talking about. The last couple of weeks of semester, all you look at the parking lots, they're full. You go to the GAC lab, it's full. You go into the library, it's full. Everybody's working. Everybody looks exhausted. They're all trying to get all this stuff done as quickly as they can. Yeah, they could have spread it out over the semester instead of trying to cram everything into the last couple of weeks. But the reality is, again, you and I need deadlines to keep us focused. So, what can you take away from this model? Well, one of the most important things that you can take away from this model is that setting deadlines is key, and setting interim deadlines will actually ramp up the team's activity. It will shorten those periods of inertia and allow for more accelerated activity to be happening. All right, so what does a mature team look like? A mature team, this is an ongoing team. This is not a temporary team. They have a number of characteristics. I'm going to be talking about each. So first, people know the purpose and mission. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? How do we go about accomplishing that? Whom are we serving, etc. So what is it? What is the team's reason for being? The raison d'être. Okay, why are we here? Another characteristic of a mature team is the existence of behavioral norms. We talked about this in the beginning of the semester. These are these well understood standards. Now, we're not talking about something that's written down. This is part of the informal organization. So these are understood but not codified. Okay, they're not in any kind of code. They're not in a manual. These are the standards that teams use to evaluate and, most importantly, control the behavior of members. Okay, so we want to constrain people's behavior to keep it in line with whatever standards we've set. So we have productivity norms that dictate the extent to which people should be, as individuals, highly productive, moderately productive, not very productive. We have appearance norms. Great example of this. Just think about your fellow students. On any given day, most days of the semester, people are dressed fairly casually. When people aren't dressed casually, when they're more dressed up, when they're, doing business casual or business professional, people will comment on it. And it's because that behavior is outside the norm. It's not the typical. People will say, do you have a presentation today? Or do you have an interview today? Basically, they're trying to ascertain why one of their members is not following the typical norm. And of course, in the case of students, more often than not, it is the case that a person has an interview or something special. There are socializing norms, the extent to which it's okay to goof off, the extent to which it's okay to get together outside of work. And then there are meeting norms. Everything from, do meetings typically start on time? Who tends to sit where? Who tends to talk versus who tends to listen? Those are all norms that teams set, that they establish over time. Now, one of the key topics associated with teams is this notion of cohesion. It says here it's the interpersonal glue that makes members of a team stick together. Another word that you might use is bonding, okay? The extent to which the team bonds, okay? This cohesion or bonding enables teams to exert control over team members, okay? So we actually keep people from behaving in ways that are counter to what the team wants, and we keep people behaving in ways that are consistent with what the team wants. Teams with high cohesiveness, the ones that have really bonded well, tend to demonstrate lower tension and anxiety. Okay, they're all on the same page together. They don't need to be stressed out. They also demonstrate less variation in productivity. Now, notice it doesn't say that they're all really productive. That's not at all what it's saying. They could all be really productive, or they could all be really unproductive, or they could all be somewhere in the middle. The point is, there's very little variation. Each of the team's members will be about the same in terms of his or her productivity. There's very little variation, and that's because the other team members exert peer pressure with those norms to ensure that everybody produces at about the same rate. If you want to be part of the team, if you want to be part of the in-group, you will align with our productivity norms. Again, when you've got high cohesiveness, the members demonstrate they're more satisfied, they're more committed, and they communicate better. So let's zero in a little bit on those norms and this graph, which is a really important one. It's on the bottom of page 3 of your lecture outline. When the productivity norm is low and the cohesiveness is also low, you're going to have a fairly unproductive team. Okay? They're not interested in being productive. They haven't really bonded, but by virtue of the fact that most everybody isn't all that interested in being productive, it's going to be a pretty unproductive team. When the productivity norm is high, when there's this notion that, hey, we ought to be producing at a high level, but cohesiveness is low, you're going to see mixed productivity. So some people will, in fact, produce at a high level, others maybe not so much. And they don't care because this is not a team that's bonded. This is not a team that exerts a lot of control over its membership. When you have a high productivity norm and high cohesiveness, this is the ideal from an organizational standpoint. You're going to have a very, very productive team. Everybody wants to produce at a high level, and because the team is bonded, they're all going to exert social pressure on each other to ensure that the productivity is high. The last quadrant is your upper left quadrant. Here you have a low productivity norm and a high level of cohesiveness. So this is a team that's very tight. They're very cohesive. They've bonded really well, and they've all agreed, we're not going to work that hard. And so what are you going to see in terms of actual productivity? Not very much at all. They are protecting each other. They have each other's backs. To use another colloquialism, they aren't going to work hard no matter what. So how do we increase cohesiveness? Well, you see 11 factors here, and what you see in the parentheses shows you the nature of the relationship between each of these factors and cohesiveness. So with cohesiveness as the dependent variable, okay, on the y-axis, you'll see a positive relationship between it and agreement with team goals. So the more that people agree with the team goals, the more cohesive the team. With size, the relationship is a negative one, so that as size goes up, cohesiveness goes down. With opportunities for meaningful interaction, the more opportunities there are, the more cohesive the group will be. With respect to enjoying working with one another, the more that team members enjoy working with one another, the more cohesive the team will be. 5 talks about homogeneity. Homogeneity is all about the extent to which people are similar to one another, or they perceive that they are similar to one another on any number of characteristics. They could be biodemographical characteristics, they could be educational characteristics, they could be functional expertise characteristics. It doesn't matter. As long as people see themselves as being similar on, again, whatever array of characteristics, they'll consider themselves a more homogeneous group. Well, the more homogeneous the team, the greater the cohesion, the more that people are likely to bond. They have lots to bond over. The opposite is true with heterogeneity. This is where you have a lot of diversity in the group, so people are very different from one another, again, on any number of characteristics. The more heterogeneous the group, the lower the cohesiveness. With team status, the higher the team status, the more important people perceive the team to be, the greater the team's cohesiveness. Inter-team competition, where you have multiple teams competing against each other, let's say within an organization, you're going to see more cohesiveness within each of those teams. Intra-team competition is when you have your focal team. If individuals on that team are competing, fighting with one another, then the team's cohesiveness will come down. Management demands, there's an inverted or an upside down U-shape relationship. So it starts out as management demands go up initially, cohesiveness goes up. So the team sticks together. It's us, the team, versus them management. And then, as management demands continue to increase, if they do, you see the teams start to fall apart. The cohesiveness starts to go down because individuals start to look out for their own self-interest. I want to make sure I don't get fired here. I'm not going down with the rest of you. So you have this inverted U shape. And finally, you have physical isolation, where a positive relationship exists such that the more physically isolated the team is from other teams, from other people, the more cohesive that team will be. Perhaps one of the best ways to help a team to bond is to separate it from everybody else, to maybe go off site for a day or a few days. And as people are only able to interact with each other, only the people on the team, they are more likely to bond with one another. All right. Another important thing to pay attention to when we're talking about long-standing teams is this notion of conformity. And with conformity, what we're talking about is adjusting our behavior to align with the norms of the team. So conforming or aligning ourselves, doing what everybody else is doing. One of the problems associated with conformity is this loss of individuality, which your text talks about, which, as it says here, is a social process through which team members lose self-awareness and its accompanying senses of accountability, inhibition, and responsibility for individual behavior. Basically, when you and I conform to a high degree with a team, we basically stop taking responsibility for our own actions. We say, well, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to be doing as a member of this team. I don't need to think about the ethics of a particular decision because the team decided to go with that decision. I was just following orders, basically. And this loss of individuality is a serious problem when we talk about the need for people to be accountable for the consequences of their decisions, whether a person makes the decision solo or a person is part of a group decision. Ultimately, individuals are accountable and will be held responsible or should be held responsible. Looking at conformity, the reason that this was interesting to people who studied groups, it came out of World War II, and we see all of these people aligning themselves and behaving consistent with Nazi idealism, and it's that whole ideology of having a superior race and so on. And one has to wonder, or at least many people wondered in the 1950s, why were so many people complicit? Why did they obey? Why did they go along with what the Nazis wanted? And it has a lot to do with what happens to you and I when we get into a group with respect to conformity. So what you see here is a famous example from one of the studies done by a guy whose last name is Ash in the 1950s, where what he did is he had people in a room, and only one of those people was actually the person who was the subject of the experiment. Everybody else was a Confederate, meaning that they knew what was going on. Okay, so they're all in the room, and they are presented with what you see in front of you on this slide. And they're asked the question, okay, you have this line, X. Which of the lines, A, B, or C, is the same length as line X? Now, if you were alone, the answer you would pick is, well, it's line B, right? Super obvious. Super obvious. But here's what happens. For most people, when they're in a group, they'll go along with whatever the group consensus seems to be or appears to be. So we have these individuals who are the subjects of our experiment. They're sitting in the room along with these Confederates, and the first Confederate chimes in and says, well, it's obvious. The one that matches line X is line A. What? The second Confederate also speaks up and says, yeah, I agree. It's definitely line A. And the third Confederate, again, remember, these are the folks who are in on the experiment. The third Confederate says, yep, you know what? I think these first two folks are totally on track here. Line A is the one that matches line X. Well, what Ash discovered was that in many cases, the majority of cases, the person who was the subject of the experiment, having heard what all these Confederates thought, would end up saying, yep, it's line A, even though they knew that the right answer was B. For whatever reason, they wanted to go along with what the group consensus appeared to be. People like to fit in. even when it goes against their own principles, their own beliefs, their own understanding of the facts. This is a fascinating observation for Ash and others to have made, because it says a lot about what you and I, the biases that conflict us when we're part of a group, frankly, the really dumb things that we will do when we are part of a group. Another characteristic of teams is status structure. So within that team, there is a status structure. There are some people who are perceived to be more influential than others, for example. Well, where does that come from? Sometimes it comes from the power that a person wields over the others. Maybe maybe they're the person who drives, or they have some sort of expert power, some sort of knowledge. The second bullet is the person's ability to contribute to the team's goals. So who is most likely going to help us achieve what we want to achieve? Who has perhaps the greatest skill or has the right skill set to enable the team to accomplish its goal? And then finally, you've got the individual's personal characteristics. You might have someone who, for example, is very charismatic, who is very agreeable and is able to encourage others to go along. Any number of personal characteristics can cause someone to have higher status in a group or lower status in a group. So teams engage in two different kinds of functions. The first is focused around the task. The second is focused around the relationship. So those you'll see on page 5 of your lecture outline, team task functions. So let's look at the next slide. Here they are. So this is all, how do we get the job done? How do we get the job done? We do that by initiating activities, by seeking and giving information, by elaborating or expanding upon concepts, by coordinating our activities, summarizing our ideas, testing out those ideas, evaluating the effectiveness of our ideas, diagnosing. But these are all task-related functions that we're performing, okay? Then there are the maintenance functions. This is the relationship stuff. This is the stuff that really, people don't necessarily think about, but this is the key to your team's success. Supporting other people, following their lead when it makes sense, critiquing them also when it makes sense. Gatekeeping communication, in other words, keeping some information only within the team, not sharing with people outside of the team. Setting standards for, how do we get along? How do we behave? What are those norms to which we're all going to, observe, what we're all going to observe? People being able to express their feelings. I'm angry about this, or I'm happy about this, or I think that's really going to work. That feels satisfying, and so on. Testing out the group's decisions. How does everybody feel about those decisions? Also, the last couple here, talking about how do we manage conflict? How do we harmonize that conflict? How do we make sure that we're all operating on the same page? Reducing tension, are we laughing together? Are we having fun together? Even though we're under a lot of pressure, perhaps to deliver a really important project, are we able to relax with each other? This takes us into the last part of this chapter, most of which you will not find this in the text, so you'll want to pay careful attention. And we're looking at how do we create effective teams. Well, there are three major categories of things that we need to pay attention to. The first is context. So with context, we need to make sure that a team has adequate resources, information, equipment, staffing, encouragement, administrative assistance, whatever it takes, all the inputs. The team also has to have leadership and structure, so people have to know what the responsibilities are. There has to be a climate of trust. People have to believe that everyone else is competent, and also that everyone else is of good character. In other words, that they'll follow through on their promises. And then the last, performance evaluation and reward systems. Those rewards have to accrue to both individuals and the overall team in order for the team to be effective. The second major category is composition. Here we're talking about first the abilities of members, and these fall into three categories. There are technical skills, So this is sort of the how to do the job. There are problem solving and decision making skills. Okay, well, when we run into an issue, which we will, I mean, this is a guaranteed thing, how do we solve the problems that arise? How do we make good decisions? And the last category of skill is the interpersonal stuff, the people who are able to smooth over the relationships, to build those relationships. We need to have all of those abilities. The second category under composition is personality, specifically things like agreeableness. To what extent are we all able to listen to each other, to be okay with hearing ideas that might be different from our own? Are we open to new experiences? Are we conscientious in that we can be counted on to do what we said we would do? The third is diversity. The reason that diversity matters is that it's the source of creativity. It's also the source of conflict. These two things go hand in hand. In order to get to a more creative solution, we have to have conflict, meaning we have to be dissatisfied with the status quo, with the way things are. We have to disagree with each other so that we can come up with new and better solutions. So we want diversity in terms of any number of characteristics, individual characteristics, personality, gender, age, functional background, expertise, education, you name it. Diversity is an absolute positive for a team that needs to be creative. Size. Okay. You'll read in different places, people will throw out what they think is the ideal size for a team. Okay, most of that stuff is absolute poppycock. It's garbage. It's baloney. Here's the real deal. The right size for any team will be, are you ready? The right size for any team will be the number of people needed to get the job done effectively and well, not one more and not one less. So, depending on the complexity of the task to be undertaken, we might need a team of 15 people. If it's a simple task, maybe a team of 3 can get the job done. But there's really no logic in saying things like the right size team is always 7 to 10. Well, not if you have an incredibly complex task, again, that needs tackling. You might need 40 people or 50 people. That will introduce some other challenges, but you have to be mindful of what is the task. That's what really drives the right size. So again, it's whatever number of people is needed to get the job done well, not one more, not even one less. Member flexibility is key. We want people who are flexible with respect to the tasks that take on, with respect to the expertise that they offer, and so on. And then last on this slide is member preferences for teamwork. You want people who actually want to work in a team. If you've got someone in your team who hates working with other people, who loathes other people, well, that's going to be tough. Even the most hardcore introvert, like me, I'm a hardcore introvert, can appreciate that when you are looking at a complex task, it's way better to work in a team. I always prefer to work with other people when taking on something that's complicated, difficult, lots of steps, lots of stages, the need for expertise that goes beyond my own. Of course I want to work with other people. So you really want people who enjoy working with others. The next piece under composition is roles. All of the roles that you see on this slide and that are in your lecture outline need to be performed. That said, it doesn't mean that you need this many people. One person can actually play multiple roles. Each of these roles is described well on page 6 of your lecture outline. Everything from linker to advisor. So read these over. Make sure you understand not only what each one does, but how they're different from one another. All right, the last of the 3 categories when we talk about creating effective teams is process. So we talked about context, we talked about composition, and now we're talking about process. Process is how we get things done. So number 1, we need a common purpose. That purpose gives us direction. It helps us make smart choices. It helps us to stay on task. It helps us to know what we shouldn't be doing as much as it tells us what we should be doing. It also gives us momentum. So we have this drive, this energy associated with that purpose, and then commitment, a dedication to that common purpose. We're all in this together. Specific goals, in fact, they need to be SMART goals because that's what facilitates communication. When we all know what it is we're supposed to be doing and the relative priority of each of those goals and how they fit together, then again, we can make smart decisions as we're going. Okay, this is all part of that process. Team efficacy. We've talked a lot in class about self-efficacy, which is task-specific self-confidence. Well, here it's task-specific team confidence. So the extent to which collectively we feel like, yeah, we can do this. We can make this happen. It's not just the adding up of individual self-efficacies, but rather looking around at your teammates and going, yeah, you know what? With this group of people, we can do anything. We will be amazing. We will accomplish great things together. The fourth bullet talks about productive conflict. So there are two different kinds of conflict. One is cognitive. This is all oriented around the task. And the other is affective. And as you know, whenever I say the word affect or affective, we're talking about emotions. So good conflict is the stuff oriented around task. So the cognitive stuff. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? Maybe we have some disagreements about that we need to work through. How is it that we're going to accomplish this task? Again, that's cognitive conflict. And as we work that through, we come up with better solutions, and that produces a better output. The affective conflict just takes away from us building positive relationships, and it takes away from us being able to accomplish our task. So we want productive conflict, and we want to eliminate, reduce non-productive or affective conflict. The last bullet and the last point of this narrated PowerPoint is the lack of social loafing. Social loafing is what happens when a team member relies on the efforts of others and fails to contribute his or her own time, effort, thoughts, or other resources. Basically, we use words like slacker, okay? The person who isn't doing their share. Ultimately, what needs to happen in a really high functioning team is people hold each other accountable. So each person has their set of responsibilities, their set of activities, and the other members of the team hold that person accountable for those individual responsibilities. They're needed in order for the team to accomplish its overall goal. We have to hold people accountable, which means individuals need to be told, by the rest of the team, okay, this is the deadline. This is what we need to get done by this, by this time. You need to do this part. If you're going to have any issues with that, you need to contact somebody else by, et cetera, et cetera. We have to hold people accountable. We can't have people slacking off if we want to have an effective team. And that's a wrap for Chapter 9.